Are we ready? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all listeners and viewers throughout Alaska and the United States. You are watching an episode of Denakanaga's Our People Speak series with the Morris Thompson Cultural and Visitor Center, Tanana Chiefs Conference, and Denakanaga. I am Sharon Hildebrand. Today's presentation is Scrape and Call, Moose Hunting in Alaska with Sterling DeWild. We also want to thank our major sponsor, Doi Unlimited, and during today's showing, if you feel compelled, you can give to the Morris Thompson website to show more viewings or shows such as this, and we very much appreciate your support, and we can create more types of programming such as this. There are links on there that you can find when you go to the website. Again, I'm Sharon Hildebrand. I'm from Nulato. I was raised by my grandmother, Ellen Peters, there. I am the Village Outreach Liaison at Doi Unlimited. And we have a wonderful guest this evening, Sterling DeWild. Welcome, Sterling.
Thank you.
Can you tell us and our listeners a little bit more about yourself and where you're from and where you were raised?
Okay. Yeah. My name is Sterling, and I'm the youngest of 14 children raised to Amelia and Lloyd DeWild on the North Fork of the Huslia River. That's about 40 miles northwest of Huslia, below the Arctic Circle. My father was Californian. He moved up into Alaska back in the early 40s, I believe. My mother was full Alaskan Native, Upper Khoikhon Athabaskan in the Bear Clan. She was raised, born in Cutoff, which later became Huslia, and was raised up in the headwaters of the Huslia River, South Fork, North Fork area. And she, like her parents, never moved into the village when westernization hit the native cultures, and people started to congregate into areas that were once gathering spots further downriver from their own country, and those became the villages. People generally started to go to school and learn languages and whatnot. My mom's parents were very afraid of sickness and were the last to push back, I guess, against that gathering, giving up their semi-nomadic lifestyle. And so she was raised in the bush just as we were, and just as her parents were. She never lived in a village or a city in her life, other than maybe a childhood in Cutoff for a brief period. And then she married my father at 16. They moved to a homestead between Ruby and Galena, about 20 miles east of Ruby, downriver from Ruby. And they had 6 kids there on the north bank of the Yukon. My dad delivered 6 of them, and they ultimately had to move out of that country, and that was near the Cochrane Hills. It was notorious for not a safe place to live, and so ultimately they had to move, and they loaded everything into a boat. They rented a ride from their friend, and Billy DeMoss, I don't want to say names, actually. Terrible with names. So they had a friend load up all of their dogs and 6 kids, and they puttered on down the river, down the Yukon, up the Kaikuk River, another 190 miles to Huslia. That was my mother's relatives' village then, or Cutoff. And they stayed for a period, and using the same boat, same transportation. They loaded up again and continued up further upriver. My dad was somewhat of a loner, I guess, and he was social enough, but he could do without people. And my mom loved the country; she loved her lifestyle, and so they ventured further north, even further north than my mother's parents had ever really lived. My dad pushed pretty far into Eskimo country, in fact, and they almost starved one winter. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, they had to move further back downriver about 20 miles to where I was raised. I think it was about 120 miles at that point from Huslia.
Wow, very adventurous family. So there was 14 of you, you said?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing that there was a pecking order. Where were you in that pecking order?
Of course, I was the bottom. But I had a trump card, though. I did have a trump card, and that was my mom. Um, she ruled with a wooden ladle or whatever solid blunt object was nearby at the time if she needed it. And so, yeah, I was her baby. And you're right, there was definitely a pecking order, and quite, could be in a lot of ways a savage one. I mean, we didn't have much social emotional development out there to begin with, and so in a lot of ways we were kind of like a couple packs of wolves, 2 litters of them, in fact, the first 7 and then the second 7. And so, but we looked out for each other too, and generally the oldest of the first 7 looked out for the oldest of the second 7, and on down the line.
So I'm guessing that in you growing up in that traditional lifestyle, you probably learned more of the way of living off the land than anyone else that grew up in the village, because it was your day-to-day life, right?
Yeah,
Can you explain some of the processes involved in moose hunting? What was involved?
Okay, I guess first I'll add a slight correction there. I would say that I was more knowledgeable and practiced in the practical traditional lifestyle, but I was lacking some in that we were all just our own little universe out there, and everybody outside of it didn't quite make sense to us, and that included the other natives in Huslia. And actually they had a very rich culture that we were short on, because our mom married our dad when she was 16, and although she had learned a lot, she was still 16, and she had to learn twice as much about the white world or more, and so she, a lot of that trumped her cultural practices, I guess. She spoke her language very well, though, and she kept track of it even better than most. But in some ways, our songs and our dances and some practical, we a lot of the things we learned from a white man, and a lot of them weren't the most practical ways either. And we didn't realize that until we grew up and left home, and we're like, oh man, these people. We kind of make fun of sometimes maybe maybe their ways looked odd to us, but we didn't know you could do certain things,
That reminds me of something, because your family is very artistic and such, and it makes me think that you guys had some time to think about ways of creating your artistic talent.
Yeah. I would say that there isn't much to work with out there, for one, and to come up with something new from something mundane that you see every day is kind of opens that universe, I guess, so that you're not just you can create your own toys, or you can fix your own stuff, and it's got its own personal attachment to you, I guess.
Awesome. In terms of our theme is moose hunting in Alaska, and we're in the fall time now. And what time of the year do you usually go moose hunting, and why is that time of the year chosen? Is there other times of the year that you went out when you were growing up?
Right. Yeah. That now I would say the biggest determining factor of that would be temperature, how well you can keep it. And nowadays we have freezers, so that really opens the door to when and you can get it and how long you can keep it, until you get freezer burn, of course. But without the freezer, you really have to pay attention to when you're getting them even more, because they only keep for so long. And so if I were anywhere without a freezer handy, I would likely hunt earlier than the season typically. So I would say like late to mid to late August and it's hopefully still dry, unless it's really wet out, and then you probably don't want to hunt because you wouldn't be able to keep anything very long. If it's dry enough, you can hunt early, and you could cut your meat to dry to preserve it, and it will dry. Even the ribs and a lot of the bones will dry out enough that you can preserve them long enough until you consume what you can't preserve, and then you've preserved what you can. So, yeah, early August would be the best time for a bull for that reason, because it's fat and you can dry it in time before it spoils.
Not only drying meat, but did you guys also put your moose meat up on one of those stands, not a cache, but up high, so you could cut some off during the winter and stuff to keep it away from animals?
Yeah, we did. We definitely hung our meat. Sometimes we would create a rack and lay them up on top as well, as you described. Typically, we would keep them hanging until they freeze, and then we can put them inside of our smokehouse or cache, actually.
I read a story where they would also, long time ago, they would also cover it with the hides of the moose or other animals just to keep crows and such off of it. Was that something that you guys did long ago, or?
Hopefully we wouldn't leave it out long enough to let crows come around. We never had to shoo them off of our meat too much, but then you do want to make sure there is something covering them. You are right. There needs to be. We had the luxury of tin. You know, we had all of the amenities of what we have today to be comfortable, but just a lot less of it. So we ran out of sugar often, we ran out of tea often, we ran out of crackers often. We had tin, we just didn't have very much of it. And so I would say that, you know, we didn't have to use moose hides or anything, but if we didn't have tin, we definitely would have used the hides. A lot of the time in the winter, we would spread them out in the snow so they were nice and flat, yes, and then we would use that to cover certain parts of the meat if they were needed to be left out, such as pieces that we were eating off of currently. We always had the chunk of meat, like a quarter or a brisket and so on, out that we were feeding off of. We didn't cut them up into dinner-sized chunks or nothing and
like
put it away.
today, yeah.
But yeah, as you did mention earlier, we hunted in August so that we could dry our meat and get it put away in time to go hunting for a suck-in moose, and that would be closer to mid-September. Hopefully around then we could get a moose, and we would have to time it just right. We'd have to be watching the weather, listening to the AM radio for one, that always helps, but also just taking a look out the window every day, walking down to the river every day, just watching the season, trying to get a feel for it. And then when we felt like it was about 2 weeks away from the first frost, then we would be out hunting, and hopefully we would get one within that week, and that way we can hang the moose and it'll keep for up to 2 weeks.
Okay. Do you remember the first time your siblings or your parents took you out moose hunting?
Yeah, I wish I could remember more vividly my earlier memories, but I do remember, when I was about 6 or 7, being first able to go on the longer hunts with my family, and we always had a trip we made in the spring, and in the fall time we would go to a place we called Birch Tent. And that was a garden that we had about 20 miles upriver from our cabin. And our river was, as big as the Chena here and about as deep. And our birch tent was near the country where I mentioned our dad almost starved them all near Eskimo country, and, just scrub brush and really no man's land, and there wasn't much moose, but the soil was great. It was real thick topsoil. My dad being from California, he knew how to grow. And so every spring we would go up to that garden and we would work it, we would till it, we would plant our seeds, and that usually took a long time. That was like my favorite time of year. We would be getting out, the geese and ducks would be fat and huntable.
Oh, cool.
And so then fall time we would have to harvest, and around the time that we were harvesting in August, the last of the garden would be the time that we were starting to, we'd have our guns sighted for moose. And yeah. And so that was my next favorite time of year. I would say spring was more favorite because of the long winter we're crawling out of, but I don't know. Fall time's a good time of year, and it was mostly because of that fresh moose meat. I mean, the taste of a bull, that meat, especially a bull moose that's not too ruddy, because we got them at the right time of the year when they weren't stinky, and they had that smell, but they weren't gamey. And so our first moose hunt was always upriver as far as Birch Tent, and that's 20 miles, is a good long run for a young kid. And
So for our listeners out there who might not be familiar with hunting and such, can you explain to them what the gamey thing is that you're talking about on moose in the fall time?
Oh, gamey. Okay, so just about all animals have a certain amount of game. There's some that don't, like porcupine but like beaver, moose, even caribou, goat, they all have their own certain unique musk, I would say, and usually the male of the animals have more musk. And with bull, it's described as a rut, and it's a smell that it comes from glands in their body, mostly urine. They stamp in it and roll in it, and it gets stinky, and it also has a lot of hormones and other stuff in it that creates this unique, strong, pungent smell. Hard to describe, but yeah, sweet, pungent smell.
So for our listeners out there that might have just joined us, we're here with Sterling DeWild. He's sharing some stories of his growing up and hunting along the Kaikuk River at his home camp. He was sharing how they would gather and hunt, and how luckily they didn't become vegetarians, right, in the no man's land?
Yeah. The mountain we grew up on was called the Badlil. That's the Athabascan name for it.
Oh.
And that means whose mountain, that translates to. And that was whose mountain because it was the border between Indian and Eskimo country. And nobody really claimed it. Nobody could really live there. And it spanned about 70 miles probably between, either side of the Brooks Range. And Huslia Mountain and Purcell Mountain, that was the Badlil.
So growing up, were you guys able to see some people from across the way, or they were already settled in their own villages and stuff? You guys were kind of like a unique family then, or?
Yeah, we were. Everybody basically. There were other families before I was born that lived out, I believe. Barney Atla still does actually below Huslia. So on the Kaikuk River, he's more between villages. I guess what made us unique is that we were really off in the opposite direction of anybody. Usually with native cultures and stuff, when you spread out through the country, usually there's a point A, B, and a C kind of in the straight line or something. Well, we were off in direction Z. So we were, any direction away from us. North was 70 to 100 miles of the Brooks Range to Norvik or Buckland, and Allakaket and Anaktuvik Pass was in another direction, but that was over Cone Mountain, and so really the only direction to civilization from us was Huslia.
So you guys were covering a large expanse of land there, right? Because right there is on the map is showing Huslia.
Mm-hmm.
So were you guys going as north as Shungnak then?
Well, now Shungnak is more accessible to Huslia because we were up northwest of Huslia, and that tucked us behind the Badlils and Cone Mountain. Whereas from Huslia you can go kind of swing east and head up towards Shungnak. Hold on a second. We were more up in this direction. And so in order for us to get to anybody would be Huslia. If we went up further north, we would be along Kotzebue, and Shungnak just not accessible from our area.
Okay.
Yeah. So, some areas are accessible only from one direction, and Shungnak is one of them. You don't want to come from our direction. There was one Eskimo that I know of that was alive during our time there, and I don't have any memories of him. I believe he was last. There was one other person that lived out in that country was pretty nomadic, and he was from up around Shungnak or Ambler. He was an Eskimo named Aluktuk, as best I could pronounce or remember his name. And he used to come over and stop at our cabin. I don't have any memories of him, just stories. I think the last time he came around was about when I was a baby or something. But he was a nomad kind of dude. Very a lot of mystery with that guy.
Wow.
And he ultimately he just disappeared.
So, thinking about hunting, and you mentioned the fall time hunt, I remember growing up and hearing of the men going out and hunting cow moose. Was that something that your family did?
Yeah, we did. 14 kids and at least 9 dogs at a time. We were going through probably 12 moose a year. But not that there were 14 kids there any one time, and not that we always got 12 moose in a year. But I would say we could have eaten 12 moose in a year pretty easily if we had. But we harvested in accordance to the season that the moose are in. And that, I mean, we harvested them when they weren't calving. If they weren't fat, we wouldn't bother with them either. And we would consider that a waste. And so we hunted cow moose. We would usually eat up our first moose in the fall that we got, mid to late September. If we didn't luck out with that second moose, and we'd be hunting into October for a rubber bull, we called them. Shoot, because they're so tough and so little fat on them. You shoot them, they'll bounce back up. Either that or eating them is like chewing on a rubber ball. Excuse me. But yeah, so we were probably done eating our bull meat, our fat fall moose meat, by November, and then we would be looking for a fat cow in November, hopefully to get us through December and January, and then mid-January into mid to late February, we would also be looking for a barren cow, and that's just a cow that hasn't gotten pregnant over since last fall and isn't having a calf tag along. Then we would try to harvest that, and that would be our last bit of fresh meat in the winter, and that would have to tide us over until spring when the geese flock in, waterfowl. And until then, we were literally starving. We were probably lacking a lot of vitamins and proteins by the time the geese came in, because we were surviving on the last of our dry meat from the fall, the first moose in the fall, if we had any. We were pounding it up in a clean sock and with a hammer, and then we'd soak that pounded up dry meat in water overnight with some beans, and then we'd boil that up, and we were eating beans and rice every day with soaked dry meat. And tell you how sick you get of. I can't tell you how sick you can get of that. And
it gets old real fast.
Yeah. So
wow, you guys get creative in ways of preparing for. I think hats off to your mother and father for being able to think of ways to find methods to feed your large family. That was a feat in itself, right?
Yeah, it was, and must have taken a lot of patience and faith at times, and yeah, they got through, and it was, according to my brothers, our dad was definitely a hardcore conservationist too. He rotated his crops in his garden. He rotated his trap lines when he trapped. He rotated his hunting grounds if he could, and he would not take an animal out of season even if they were starving, apparently. But they survived, and in the summer they had fish, but that was sometimes a tough survival when you didn't get lucky, I guess.
Yeah. Thinking about it, and today, that far up the Kaiguk River, it's not really known for much salmon. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So, with that in mind, to supplement your meals during the winter, would you be getting whitefish and pike and stuff then?
Yeah, we didn't do much for splitting and drying fish because our salmon, the only salmon that made it up as far as us were the dog salmon or chum salmon, and they were spawned out by then, very poor. We would maybe eat one or two in the summer if we found a good red one. Mostly we just kept the dogs fed during the summer off of those. And pike, we dried some pike, but generally we ate them up too, though we were living off of pike bellies. We rarely ate anything but the pike bellies and the guts. We'd split the guts open, scrape them out real good. It's like octopus or something. And the bellies on the pike have some nutritional value, quite a bit of nutritional value to it, whereas the rest of the pike is relatively poor. We would usually not eat that unless we were just making Indian ice cream with it, putting other stuff in it. But typically the rule of thumb is if you're starving, don't eat the whole pike, throw most of it, because it actually takes more energy to digest some of their back tissues than you get out of it.
Wow. And also, it was survival then. Was there a preference that you had in terms of which harvested moose that you would prefer, if it was the bull or the cow? Was the meat different, or?
It was all about fat. In the end, fat is livelihood when you're out there. You can always catch small game. In fact, we always caught spruce chicken and rabbits. They taste really good, but you can't live off of them. They're just not, they're too lean. Ultimately, you'll die of starvation just while your stomach is full too. So we harvested the fattest animal basically to try to restock our reservoir of lard. And so we took all of the excess fat that wasn't, consumed with the meat, and we cut it up, ground it up, and rendered it down. And usually we were hoping to get a moose that you would get two 5-gallon buckets of tallow out of it.
Wow.
That's moose lard. And back then we were looking for, something with good 6 inches of fat would be good. But, you don't usually get that unless it's a barren cow or something. Those are the legendary stories of that one fat mountain of a moose. But I'd never actually seen 6 inches, I don't think. But I remember we used to get regularly big bulls with 4 inches, 5 inches of fat on them. And cow moose is a little bit harder to find that's good and fat, but it takes skill to be able to recognize which ones are fat and which ones aren't. It takes a lot of skill just to recognize which one's a bull and which one's a cow when they don't have antlers on. You shoot the wrong one, man, everybody in camp was pissed. So then we had to eat it, And so then that meant we were eating a rubber bull, and it takes a lot of chewing to eat a rubber bull.
So thinking back when you were younger, can you share what your favorite memory was of a time when you were out hunting?
Oh boy, there were so many. I don't know. Favorite. Well, probably like the most exciting story. That was like one of the last times I went hunting with my late brother Vaughn, and he was living out there with us, and there was my mom and dad and me, and my brother, one of our older brothers, Lee, had come up the river. Vaughn hadn't been living with us, but there was just me, my mom and dad living out there then, well, my mom really liked to hunt, and my brother Lee had come out. It was a good year for moose, because on the way up, I think they shot one moose. We did. There was me, my mom, and my dad in my dad's long 32-foot long boat, and my brother Lee and Vaughn were in another boat that belonged to Lee. He is coming home from Fairbanks where he lived, and so on the way up the river, 2 boats, we ended up shooting a moose. Good deal, good luck. And so we left the moose because we were loaded pretty well. We were traveling from Huslia. So got up to the river, we unloaded, and Vaughn and Lee, I think there might have been a third person, they went back down to get the moose, and they shot another one, which was good because, Lee needed to take moose, and Vaughn wanted some meat for somebody back in Huslia, and we needed at least two for some reason. And so Lee ended up only taking two, like a half a moose, and we ended up with an extra one. And so my mom was a little bit irritated, and she still, because we had more meat than she had wanted. And so we had to dry that whole moose, me and my brother Vaughn, and we cut it up, got it dried out just to make Mom happy so that we can go out for a second moose. And then so it was getting near that end of the season. In fact, we were thinking about maybe shooting a cow if it didn't have a calf and it looked fat and so on. But our dad was kind of against it. Like I said, he was more of a conservationist. My mom was all go, and she knew a cow was going to be fatter and tastier too. And so we were heading down the river, and boy, that must have been about 300, 400 yards stretch on the river. We're cruising along. My mom and my brother Vaughn were up in front of the boat, and I could tell my mom had an itchy trigger finger. She kept taking that scope cover off, putting her gun up and practicing, you know. And I was like, boy, she's really ready to shoot. And like I knew she was upset because we had to go through a whole moose and a half to make sure she could get her hunt in. And so anyway, we come down this one straight stretch not far below our cabin, and there's a moose way down there, 400 yards away. And I see her sitting up, getting ready to shoot, and I hear her and Vaughn talking, and she says, I heard her say, "Is it a cow?" And because she wanted it to be a bull so bad, but I heard her say, "Is it a cow?" And Vaughn said, "Uh-huh. Okay, boom." She shot. Later on, she said, "Oh, I thought I said, is it not a cow or something?" She thought she played it off like she meant something else, and Vaughn gave her the wrong cue, and it was all his fault. But she shot that moose at about 300 yards.
Wow.
and moving boat, and we got down about 250 yards, and it walked off and dropped. And then my brother Vaughn went up the bank, and he went to finish it off. And sometimes moose are actually difficult to finish, and it's better just to use a knife. He ended up shooting it several times to put it down, and then we went to go cut it up. It was a nice fat cow, She'd hit it right through the heart at 300 yards from a moving boat, no kidding, with a 308 scoped Remington.
Wow.
Yeah, and shooting offhand, I think she had one elbow on her knee.
Wow.
Yeah,
Annie
pretty
Oakley,
amazing.
huh?
Yeah, Annie Oakley. I would never do that.
Wow. Very cool.
Yep, and but yeah, that should have been the end of the story. But so we're cutting up this moose, right? And my brother Vaughn, he was the right-hand man, so he's the man with the knife mostly. And my dad, he's captain, in there. And me, I'm just dawdling around, taking care of stuff, enjoying, looking for berries. And Mom's like looking after me. And so I right next to where we dropped this moose, there was this patch of just about every kind of brush and tree you could find in that country. I mean, there was poplar willow, there was stunted birch, there was jack spruce, there was alder, there was sandbar willow, all in this one spot, and it was just thick, and probably only about 30 yards around, And I was looking back there, and I was thinking, boy, that almost looks like the shape of a paddle back there. And I'm looking at it for a while, and I'm like, no, that's not. And they keep working. Pretty soon I'm like, boy, that thing moved. And second time I seen it move, I said, hey, I think there's a moose back there, guys. And they looked at me, and they looked back there, and they were, okay. They went back to cutting, And I'm like, no, why aren't they doing anything? And I don't know why. Maybe they didn't believe me, or they didn't think it was that close, possibly, because it was so thick. And so I kept looking back there, and I'm like, I'm seeing something. So I climbed up a tree between the boat and the moose they were cutting up. And once I got up the tree, I'm looking down, I'm like, guys, there's a moose 30 yards back there. And then they got aware, because then they honed in on it and they started moving. Then the moose really started moving, and then started making noise and crashing, and it was pretty pissed. It was eyeballing us that whole time, figuring, because we'd shot its cow. And so for the next half an hour after that, about 30 minutes, that moose was just going in a 180-degree circle between downriver and upriver, about 30 yards from us, with its head down, just backing side to side, doing that, looking for a way at us. And my mom got me down into the boat, and she was standing on the bow with the rope ready to push out in case you had to ditch the guys. And her gun's in the boat. And so, and you know, my brother Vaughn and my dad had both. My dad had a 30-06, and my brother Vaughn had a 308 BLR. And yeah, they just tracked that moose. That moose went upriver, went all the way downriver, went all the way back upriver again to about 1 o'clock or whatever, and finally it found where there were two, between the tree I had climbed and another tree, there were just kind of some low-hanging limbs that, you know, it stunted the brush and stuff from growing, so there was kind of a hole right there, and it put its head down and kind of just started to charge right through that hole at us, at them. And they both fired almost simultaneously and dropped it. And
Wow.
yep. So that was the fall. We got 4 moose between 4 people.
Wow.
And, needless to say, we had a lot of moose meat that winter.
That is a really good story. Would you say you were still in your teens, or you were younger than that?
I was probably around 11 or 12.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
No wonder Mom was trying to protect you.
Yeah, yeah. I was using a chainsaw at that age, but you know, under close scrutiny sometimes, and yeah, I was using a shotgun and a 22, and I also carried a rifle, but
Yeah.
I hadn't shot anything with it yet.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Again, you're listening to Sterling DeWild share stories of growing up along the Kaikok River with his family. Thinking back to when you were preparing for the hunt, what's some of the things you would do in preparation for the hunt?
Sharpen knives for one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my dad, he was pretty skilled sharpener, I would say, and kind of a, I mean, he was not Nazi side of Germany, but he was mostly German, and I think his ancestors had actually been occupied more times than anybody on this continent. But he was very strict, and there was only one way to do things, and that was the right way, and there was like 100 ways to F it up. And so I would say there's at least 2 or 3 ways, but he was hardcore. And so, you know, coming to sharpening knives, sharpening axes, it was the same thing. He could shave with his axe or his knife. And so we kind of prided ourselves to try to almost reach that level if we could. And there was, you know, something we call sticky sharp, and that was how we all learned to sharpen our knives too, where it was sticky sharp. Otherwise, you didn't know how to sharpen knives. And it's basically when you touch it, not going this way, but just touch it, you can feel the razor sharpness grab your skin a little bit, and it feels like it's sticking. And so that was one thing that we, you know, wanted, is our knives to be very sharp. So we weren't expiring ourselves and tiring out our wrists and cutting our hands while we're trying to butcher the animal. Other things that we, you know, also our axes were sharp, and typically you wanted like what we call a boy's axe. You know, it's a small-handled axe with a relatively small head, not for splitting, it's more for chopping willow, small trees if you need to, and maybe some splitting. But especially for moose hunting, it would be used for chopping willow, and that's used to keep the hide or the meat and everything off of the mud, and depending on where you get it, willow can be crucial to keeping your meat clean. And also, you know, we had the luxury of having synthetic tarps and canvas tarps too, and so we made sure those were folded and dried well and clean, you know, and made sure our cooking, we had a steel grill that we used for cooking to make camp comfortable. You know, we made sure we knew where that was, located all of the necessities like rope. We rarely used any nails or hammers to make any racks. We usually used rope in the field, at least. And so we usually tried to carry rope. My dad always had to come along, which wasn't always available. It seems like every time you get a moose, the come along is somewhere else, and you end up swimming. And so, yeah, probably a bathtub or something to put stuff you're saving, like the gut fat and stuff in. plastic bags if we had the luxury. We didn't have much of that growing up, though. So we tried to have wash tubs available. That was what they had before game bags. And let's see what else my dad loaded ammunition. We used all handmade ammunition. Sometimes we bought ammunition and went through it, but practically everything we shot from 410 on up to our largest caliber was hand loaded.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about it, when you're putting away the moose, sometimes you have to make sure you look around so no big animals come around. Were you the spotter then?
We were mostly told not to wander too far, so I guess we were the spotter in a sense. If anybody was going to get eaten, it was probably going to be us little kids wandering too far.
Yeah.
So we were always doing circles and exploring, especially because moose hunting was a time when we got out away from our camp, and to me that was my first memories of the adventure of it, was just getting out away from our camp, because we didn't really get out too much. Our universe out there was limited to how far our little legs could take us, and our dad didn't burn no gas to take us on Sunday picnics, maybe once a year. Mm-hmm. But usually it wasn't a Sunday picnic. It was like we were going upriver to the garden to go dig soil and harvest or cut logs or saw lumber or something.
It was all for necessity.
It was all for necessity. And so during those times, moose hunting, we weren't really working our butts off during moose hunting. We were hunting, and that's adventurous. That's not really work if you're enjoying it so much, So that's why it was so fun. And that moment we got a moose and everybody's cutting it up, and if we had any spare time, we would be running off and exploring something we hadn't seen, because we might be 10 to 20 miles away from our normal range.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about it, and today, does your family still go back to some of those hunting places that you went to growing up?
Yeah, I would say Rico does most frequently, because he's out there.
Rico for our listeners that are not familiar?
Yeah, Rico's he frequents Husley often, and he's settled down out in the cabin there, and he traps it and spends a lot of time in that country. But I haven't actually been home in about 10 years, and it's just, I'm got my civil engineering degree. I started working, and I try to hunt closer to where I live now, just because you could, I do well. I'm a government employee. I make a pretty good salary now. I feel very successful, but I don't feel so successful that I could afford the airfare nor the freight that it would cost to go and get the moose and then haul it back to Fairbanks. So I really don't even go very far from home hunting here in Fairbanks. My hunting range is right across the river, and even though the competition is pretty heavy there, I find if you can use some of our traditional methods of hunting and traveling and mesh that with the technology that we have and materials we have available, including the use of cell phone service, and coupled with that adventurous spirit that I have, willing to swim out in the middle of a frigid lake to paddle a moose back on the moose. I think it's possible to be competitive even close here in Fairbanks, and even so close that you could bring your daughter or your kid out. I bring my daughter out to my moose camp pretty often, and although she doesn't like to be out, when you're most likely to get a moose, which is when it's cold, she likes staying in camp more. It still gives her a bit of the experience, and I'd love to bring back a moose into camp for her to cut up. That would be nice.
That's always good memories, thinking back of the memories you have shared of you growing up. I'm sure she's going to have those memories as well of you bringing her out. So
yeah,
it's a great tradition for sure. And you said earlier that your mom was upset that you got an extra moose because it's a lot of work, right?
It is. It is a lot of work to put a moose away. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of work to cut it up and get it home too, especially if you're by yourself. There's a lot of technique to it, and but Yeah, most of the work is once you get home and you got to process it. And yep, if it's a lot of meat, you're looking at a lot of work. And if you're away out in the woods and there's not a lot of entertainment, it's kind of could feel like somebody robbed you of the fun part of your experience, I guess. Not so much the killing the animal part, but the hunt, going out, the necessity to get it, the process that's involved that we were just describing, and my mom loved to camp and she loved to go out, but we needed a reason to have those experiences too.
That's the part I've always heard people share, and my family as well, that it's the camping part that you enjoy most. And then once you do, and you're lucky, that's where the work begins, right?
Yes, yep. That's where the work begins. That's where you can really see how far your grit will get you, Definitely have to push yourself, usually physically and mentally, to get the animal back and hung up. Depends, though. Sometimes it's easy. I mean, depends on how you're hunting and how lucky you are, I guess. Sometimes you might be lucky enough to get an animal right on the edge of the bank and you've got 1 foot on the boat and 1 foot on the bank when you're done and you're just putting pieces in the boat. But when you have a long ways to go with it, it could be a whole different experience, and even nearly traumatizing when you got to keep going and going and going and going and you're just by yourself. I've pulled moose out of the swamp by myself before. I'm pretty persistent, though. I've literally pulled a moose out of a swamp by myself, but it just depends on how hard you want to work for it.
Yeah.
You can decide to let it go, or you can decide this is what I want to do, and it's just all up to you, I guess.
And thinking about, the ingenuity that you have to have out there in the woods in wanting to bring in that moose, if it's just you or you forget to come along, would you say that had to do with your degree selection in engineering?
Yeah, well, my degree selection in engineering had a lot to do with how I was raised, I guess. Yeah, problem solving with limited resources. Mind over brawn over brain. Sorry. I think I knew I wanted to be a civil engineer before I left home. I knew I wanted to be able to go anywhere and take what resources I have and have a vision of what I want and take it from raw tundra to your final product.
I love that. So thinking about when you were putting away the moose and preparing to process it, is every part of the moose utilized? Is there some parts that you leave there, or?
Depends a bit. I think I can't speak culturally for everybody or for any group hardly, because, like I said, I was raised outside a bit. But we generally took everything, including the hide. Our mom, she tanned hides. We didn't always, though. When you're going through that many moose, it was our dad actually. He had a technique of leaving the hide on the moose, the last one that we got, and he hung it that way. We didn't do that later on because we were too spoiled and we didn't like cutting frozen moose hides off. And but he claimed it kept it bitter, which I think it did. It probably keeps it from freezer burn. And so a lot of the moose that we got, the hides were sectioned up, and then we would cut them, use the hides for put a hole through it and a loop of string, and then you tie it on a branch near your marten trap, or it attracts animals. As animals are looking for like marten are looking for things in the trees to hunt, and that skin catches their attention real quick. And we would also use it for babish to make rawhide rope and for snowshoes and stuff. Our mom tanned them. So we use we use just about everything, but we weren't so in need that we didn't have metal pots or plastic bowls or anything. So we didn't actually use like the bladder to make bowls or bags or anything like that. Most of what we were keeping was food. The bones we saved for the marrow, and then once we got the marrow out, we threw them to our dogs to chew on. Then once the dogs chewed on them, we raked them into a pile, and then in the springtime we burned that pile of dog poo and bones, and then we took all the ash and then threw it inside of this snow machine track that was on its side, created kind of like a round corral. And my dad would throw all that stuff in there along with compost from the garden. And he had that process. He was using, canine poo isn't typically used for human farming, but there was a process that he treated it that made it okay, but you could only use a certain part of it. And so we did use everything. All that bones from the moose went back into our garden essentially in the end. And but mostly, we ate everything. We ate one of the stomachs, we ate the heart, we ate the kidneys, we ate the liver. About the only thing that didn't get eaten by anything, including the dogs, is probably the lungs, and that's about it.
In thinking back, growing up, what was your favorite part of the moose that your mom prepared or dad?
All right, it's my favorite part here. And it's hard to say because it's a toss-up, actually. There's that first thick, juicy moose steak from the rump, a moose rump steak. Now that is just the best. And when you quarter off the hind legs, you got the rump left back here, and that's the part that has the most fat. And
that's the prime rib of the moose, right?
Yes, the prime rib of the moose. I think so. I don't know too much about the.
It's very tender.
It's it's tender. It's juicy, and it's got a lot of flavor. There are more tender parts, like the tenderloin up underneath the rump, and then there's the back strap back here, which is also good. And you got to know how to take them apart so that you can preserve all of these pieces in their entirety, so you could have your back strap and you can have your tenderloin. And so, a lot of people prefer the tenderloin in here because it's the best and the softest, but actually it's not the most flavorful. The most flavor is off of the rump steak. And, it's got that big old ridge of fat. And, growing up, like I said, we were surviving off of what we had barely. And, we were surviving off of what fat we had. We were always looking for more fat. And, the more fat you got, the more flavor you got, the more energy you got, the more warm you stay. If you're just eating lean, you're not going to be putting on much weight, and you're not going to be staying very warm, and you'll be running out of energy way quicker throughout the day. And so that fatness kind of represented our livelihood being lifted for the next few months, because now we had a lot of energy and life was good. To me, that speaks a lot for if we were a bigger group, I could see how that could play a lot into affecting a culture, a culture's ability to preserve their language, develop their art, their songs, their dances, whatever they do, be it creating totem poles or scraping smiley faces and rocks or whatever. The ability to do that represents leisure, a high livelihood, a high level of livelihood. That means they were living fat. And when you don't have enough fat and you're starving, you're not scraping on rocks, you're not carving, you're not singing, you're just surviving. And that's how a culture dies, is if you're not able to have that fat input of calories, basically. And I would go as far as to theorize that could be a playing factor into why a lot of the cultures along the coast of Alaska are much richer in their language and their dance and their intricate songs and language development. had a lot to do with the fact that everything on the coast is covered in a thick layer of fat, whereas in the interior, a lot of these animals get pretty skinny. And in fact, moose weren't around, 100 years ago in my area. They were just caribou. The only animals that came through that were fat were caribou, and then there were bears, and that's why my people were the bear clans, because that's how they survived. That's how they made it through the winter. And they probably traded a lot with the coastal peoples too, and people further downriver that had richer fish. But essentially bringing in that 10 gallons of lard that we were looking for out of a moose was essential to our livelihood in preserving our culture out there. And when we didn't get those, if we only got 1 5-gallon bucket of tallow out of a moose, then we knew we weren't going to be living quite as happily come a month or so down the line.
So, thinking back to the rump, and how would your mother prepare that meal?
That was usually fried up with as much seasoning as we had around. Probably we didn't have too much seasoning. Our dad, he was a pretty good cook when it came to seasonings and stuff. So it could have been him that usually fried that first steak. When our dad cooked, everybody ate. But our mom was, she was a solid one. She cooked every day, made sure we ate, and she was the one that made the soup, and that was probably my favorite. There's a moose rum steak. Oh, it's making me so hungry. But anyways, there was also like our first pot of soup. Like the first thing that, like if the hunters went out, and they usually get it late at night, and then you can't bring the whole thing back. So then the hunters will come back, and with the good news, hopefully, and they'll bring back the choice parts. So they might bring a little chunk of rump, but they definitely bring the heart, the Bible, it's called. It's the fourth stomach, and the kidneys and the tongue. And the kidneys would probably get fried up with the moose steak, and the heart, tongue, and the Bible got cooked in a pot of soup together. And we had rutabagas, turnips, potatoes, carrots, fresh from the garden.
Yeah.
And yeah, I tell you, the vitamins and nutrients inside that pot of soup, especially from that taste from the stomach, it's kind of a willowy taste. But we were craving it, so to me, it's ingrained in my brain to the deepest depths, that taste and that craving for that, yeah.
Yum. Beautiful memory. Thinking back to you bringing your daughter to camp, how do you see the culture being carried on? How do you see it being brought forward from your parents onto your daughter? And how would you like to see that tomorrow?
Well, I think that I would have to really reflect all the time on what they said over and over, and remember that they had to say it over and over and over for me to finally, years after they're gone, realize, oh, that's what they were saying and why they said it. So I need to remember those things that they told me, like, I don't go down to the water at night, respect the animal, and don't say certain things that I do sometimes accidentally. Like say you're going to get this animal or you're going to cut it up, maybe might not be a good thing to talk about before you actually get anything. Like I said earlier, like I would love to cut up an animal in camp with my daughter and stuff, and I'm out hunting right now. Maybe I shouldn't be saying that. Maybe I should just say I'd really love to spend some time with my daughter, teach her how to prepare meat or something. I don't know. But there's certain ways you talk and certain ways you don't, basically. And I think that's a very, very important thing to pass on to her, to teach her to respect that animal. And she does, she knows how to pray in our ways, and she knows she knows the significance of an animal when it gives its life. And she's not squeamish about it, which is the most important thing that I want to pass on to her too. I don't want her to be squeamish about where her food comes from. And even though she doesn't like big guns, she would rather not see me shoot an animal. she doesn't, sometimes she would rather have me let it go if I told her I was going to shoot an animal. But there's other times when she knows it's a reason for it, and she's all for it. And that's the most important thing to pass on. Like we're not out there because we want to kill something. We're out there because there's a reason for it.
So you said your daughter is not wanting to be around guns right now, but you were talking about how your mother was a gunner as well. Do you see your daughter eventually being a gunner?
Yeah, well, our attitudes change for
Yeah.
sure. She's pretty adventurous. She likes to go fast like me, so I figure eventually she's going to she'll get the knack of shooting. She's actually, at the fair she did pretty well with those little pop guns, and so I've trained her a little bit with a daisy gun. She shot a 22 a couple times now, but it's too big for any accuracy. But she's warming up to the idea, and historically, all the women in my family are good shots, so I think she'll catch on pretty well. My grandma Lydia won the shooting contest in Husley a long time before I was born, and it was easy 400 yards across the river. And it was the rifle contest. She won it with a .44 pistol with open sights.
Wow.
Standing up three balloons in a row at 400 yards, no BS. Yep.
Wow. It's
Yep.
talent.
Yeah.
What's your advice for our listeners out there that might be having a hard time? You said you had some hard times. What are the things that gets you through the hard times that you've faced? What's your advice to our listeners out there that might be having a hard time that that you can share with them?
Well, we all lose somebody. There's beauty in life, and a lot of mystery in death. I mean, I don't think there's any death that doesn't leave behind mystery, and because of that, it's hard to feel resolved in the unknown, in the mystery of it. But just know that it's normal. Probably 90% of deaths leave behind mystery, even the most peaceful ones. And I think that's kind of the purpose to life, and there's beauty in that. We aren't supposed to know it all. I think there's a reason for pain and suffering, and I know that for a fact. All of this pain and suffering in the end is for a reason. If anything, it builds character for our soul, and we will all certainly rejoice in the end. There's more to this, and how that is perceived is probably not how we perceive it here, but I think in that perception that we don't know about, it's far more beautiful than we can imagine, and that once we reach that conclusion, once we reach that perception, we'll realize that all of this pain and suffering was for a reason, and the more of it, the more we grow, basically.
Thank you, Sterling. Final words for our listeners?
Well, just, don't be afraid of adventure, I guess. We worry a lot about doing stuff that we aren't supposed to do, like going down to the water at night. And you want to teach your kids that, but, as you grow up too, you can't be afraid of wolves and bears and water too much, but you want to be smart. You want to obey the rules of nature. I think that we do a heck of a lot more stupider things, though, than, say, going out on the ice in the spring when we really shouldn't. There's smart ways to do it, but drinking and driving, and I'm guilty of it in the past, is far more dumber than even going out in the woods without a rifle, which is pretty dang dumb. And so, don't be afraid of adventure. Don't be afraid of the woods. Do it smartly. Always tell people where you're going, but push your limits. Push your limits. It's beautiful out there. And, just don't fear it.
Thank you, Sterling. And for our listeners, this was Sterling DeWild. He was sharing stories of moose hunting. And we also want to say thank you for sharing your experiences, and thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you to Doy Unlimited, that we can put together these programs that are put on by the Morris Thompson Cultural Center and Visitor Center, Denakanaga and Tanana Chiefs Conference. I'm Sharon Hildebrand. Thank you.